it's useful to think in terms of like, what am I here to do? What could like the world use that I've got? And I think then to get around to doing that instead of constantly putting it off and never quite getting around to it, that is one way of understanding a meaningful life, a life well lived.
To Oliver, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Amazing. So I think that obviously the first kind of thing that someone will notice when they look at your book is the 4,000 weeks. So this kind of details kind of the idea that on average we have roughly about 4,000 weeks to live. That's about 80 years or so. I assume you picked a round number for simplicity's sake.
Yes, no, very much so. I think, in the West, certainly in the UK, you can hope for a few more than 4,000, but not very many more, really. Yeah.
Right, of course. And it's also, as you talk about in this, that's just an average. There's some people that will be more, there's some people that will be less.
Absolutely, totally.
But it's a really good framework to think about. So I was thinking about it from my own perspective, and I'm 26 years old. So if you run the maths, I've used up about 1,400 of my weeks. My parents are around about 60. I hope they don't mind me saying that. So they've used up just over about 3,000. My granddad is 86, so he's on borrowed time, I suppose you could say.
Although ultimately we all are, but yes, I agree. Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I just kind of, when I first picked up your book, because I'm the first to say, over the years, I've read massive amounts of time management books from, I kind of mentioned to you, I've sat opposite David Allen, Laura Vanderkam. But your book in particular, it kind of, what differentiates your books to the others is that this book, I feel, kind of give me a sense of clarity and also a bit of urgency. So I would love to know kind of, was that something that you aimed to do specifically when you were writing the book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the trouble with answering questions like that is always just that, like, what I really aimed to do was kind of write the book that I needed with the advice that I needed to hear. It's all an act of self-therapy in the end anyway. And I definitely am someone who experiences writing as like, well, I've just got to figure out what it's supposed to be. So it's not like I even have much choice in the matter. It's like there's something that I'm trying to clarify. And when I've done it as well as I can, you have to see what you've got in a way. But I think, yeah, I mean, what your question really makes me think of is that I think there is a way of misinterpreting the message here, which is probably encouraged by the choice of the title for the book, which is that because life is short and finite, and because we don't usually go around paying enough attention to that, that if you were to pay proper attention to that, you would then be sort of in this really hyper state where you were trying to spend every single hour of every day as an extraordinary way as possible, living a sort of really unusual life or visiting all sorts of exotic places, whatever, which is actually a very high stress kind of way to think about it, isn't it? It's like, I was sort of relaxed, and now you've reminded me of this thing, so I'm going to go through life with a fire in my, my seat of my pants on fire or something. And I hope that what comes from the book itself, as opposed to the title, is actually that if you really get into the point I hope I'm trying to make, it does lend a certain urgency to life, but it's almost like a relaxed urgency, if that isn't a contradiction in terms. It's almost like a question of stepping into reality and facing the facts, but precisely because one of those facts is that there will always be far more to do than we'll have time for, that we can't control life in the way that we wish we could. Precisely because of all that, you can sort of relax into that situation. You don't have to keep struggling to like get the most out of life. And you might discover the truth, as I think many people do, that actually lots of the most fulfilling bits of life in the end are things they didn't plan for, or they are things that don't look very remarkable from the outside. And you can sort of let all that happen and have a more fulfilling life. but not because you like scrunched up your forehead muscles or whatever to really try to make it as fulfilling as possible.
Right. And you raise a very good point there, because the amount of people that I've spoke to that have told me, I went to Rome, and I say, oh, amazing. What was kind of the best part for you? And no one ever says the Trevi Fountain. They would say, oh, it was, I was just sitting there having a great meal and I saw this incredible sunrise, or I got to speak to the culture. Right. It was the part that you wasn't expecting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is such a, sorry. Yeah. No, I think this is such a good point, because, if you look, and I say this in the book, but like if you think about anything that you have in your life that you really value, if you love your career or things you do on the side of your career, or if you're in a happy relationship or you've got really good friends, like I guarantee you none of those things, if you trace them back to how they started, they won't have started because you made a specific plan and then you carried it out and it went exactly as you thought it would and it all worked out. It'll be some sequence of events over which you didn't have full control, or even in some cases any control at all.
Right. I would kind of love to talk to you, because I guess reading your book, the kind of concept of time was one that I think kind of challenged my notion of it, because particularly in the book, you kind of give quite a few pre-industrial examples. Yeah. And reading, for instance, you write about farmers, and it kind of makes me think, in this modern world, and I'm even guilty of this myself, where I've, you kind of even talk about yourself, where you blocked out 15-minute blocks throughout your entire day. Yeah. and you've done this, and I'm guilty of it. But I'm kind of wondering where this kind of fascination, this obsession with being tied to the clock has kind of come from.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think I slightly avoid coming down with a very clear answer in the book. I'm trying to show that the way we think about time today is somewhat new. I think it's very extreme these days, but it's sort of a couple of centuries old, maybe 3 centuries old, in a more general sense. But of course, there have been different. It's all very kind of varied, right? So you get cultures which develop certain modern-looking ideas of time earlier than others, and all the rest of it. I think the fundamental thing that's worth talking about there really is just this notion that time is a thing that is separate from you, and that you have to like keep up with it or make the most of it or win a fight with it. We have all these different ways of thinking about our existence in time. And, even just that very notion of like quantifying your time and measuring how many hours you spend on one thing or another thing, it implies at an even deeper level this notion that time is a resource that you're going to try to make the best use of. And I sort of want to try, that idea is incredibly useful, and I'm not saying that we should sort of get rid of it at all, but I think that ultimately, at the deepest level, time isn't like that. So we're always going to run into trouble if we treat it as a resource to be used. We'll get some useful things out of it, but we'll also run up against the problem that it isn't ultimately like that. So, I think there's good reason to believe that if you'd been a medieval peasant, it's the example I give in the book, right? You wouldn't have, life was absolutely terrible for those people in a million different ways, but you wouldn't have had this sense of time-related stress, because you wouldn't have even thought of time as something that was hounding you or that you had to measure up to or anything like that. It would just have been like you were time. Time just unfolded in your being. You milked the cows when it was time to milk the cows, and you harvested the crops when it was time to harvest the crops. You couldn't like get an edge on that. You can't like batch process things where like a lot of productivity gurus would have you do if they're just given in nature in that way. So a lot of this had to do with people being much more closely yoked to the rhythms of the earth. And of course, there's lots of good things about the fact that we are not also yoked to the rhythms of the earth anymore. But I think one of the downsides is it leads us to think that time is just this thing that we can try to sort of control, apportion chunks of, get more value out of, and it keeps kind of shocking us in some level to remember that there's only there's a limit to how how useful that angle is, because we're always trying to assert control over time. But then when you really think about it, like, what is time? Where is it? Like, you can't actually control it. So all our efforts to kind of manage and control and master our time are eventually going to run into this stressful experience that, like, it's not the kind of thing that can be mastered or controlled or managed in that way.
Right. And a perfect example, I think, of people trying to fight or control time, which inevitably leads to unpleasant psychological consequences, I believe, is the biohacking kind of industry.
Mm-hmm.
And just a book that I was reading quite recently was Dave Asprey's Superhuman. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen it, but it's
I
and
know who he is. I haven't read
yeah,
Superhuman, but I know the bulletproof stuff in general and putting butter in your coffee and all that
that's
stuff.
it. Yeah, and the on the book it says the bulletproof plan to age backwards and maybe even live forever. So I think that this kind of idea that, this notion that maybe you can even
Mm-hmm.
have an infinite lifespan, to me is kind of similar to what you're talking about. It's a denial that we have a finite existence on the earth. And that is a conscious movement that says we can try to fight against it. And I was thinking about that whole movement, and it's kind of, to me, it seems like a very stressful life being in that kind of mindset about I have to do this and I have to do this and I need to go and get my stem cell therapy and I
Yeah.
need to go and be embarrassed about gray hairs and I need to do this. And to me, that kind of seems like just one example of an industry that is kind of not in congruence with, as you
Yeah.
said, kind of the flow of time.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I don't know that book specifically, so I don't want anything I say to be a personal attack on Dave Asprey. I will be interested to read that book. But I do think that there's sort of two parts to this. I don't think anything I'm saying means that, like, it's not going to be theoretically possible to do things to the human body that massively extend lifespan. And if somebody told me there was a simple and healthy way to live another 100 flourishing years tomorrow, I think I would take that, right? So I don't think any of this means, like, I'm not one of these people who thinks that, like, it goes against God to try to do this, so it's never going to succeed. But I think that the level on which I want to criticize it is the emotional investment in that, right? So if you're buying those books and reading those things and you're like hoping to have that for yourself, it's a very strange psychological situation to be in, given the state of the science, which is that we don't know clearly what is going to happen in each individual person's case, whether these things work or not, because you're never going to find that out until, like, you are 120 and it worked, or you are living to whatever. In the meantime, you're you're putting all your emotional investment in this idea that you don't want your time to run out. And one of the things I try to go into in the book, I guess, is how that attitude, for various different reasons, sort of systematically causes you to miss out on your actual life in the present, because you're so concerned to, like, transcend your limitations that, given that you are limited right now, limited time, limited capacities, limited energy, all the rest of it, like, that means that, like, now is not the right place to be. The future is the right place to be. The time when you get all this stuff together and it cashes out in a longer life or whatever. It has this effect of, like, turning the whole of life into this struggle to get somewhere else, which we do in lots of other ways, right? Not only the biohackers. I think just productivity culture, when it's taken to extremes, becomes this, like, certainly this was my experience for years when I was really deep into that stuff, right? It's like, soon, next week, next year, I'm going to be super optimized and mega efficient, and I'm going to be able to do everything that I feel I need to do. And in all both these cases, you set your sights on transcending your limitations. You miss out on the possibility of living to the max within your actual limitations now. And you also, I think, sort of end up making bad decisions about how to use your time, right? Because if I'm not going to I mean, you know, there's a balance to be struck here. But if for example, one of the ways you thought you could extend your life would be by giving up certain pleasures to do with the food you're eating, then like it could be right to do it, but there's a trade-off there, and maybe this present moment pleasure of eating something delicious is actually worth the balance. There's some quote from I think it was Kingsley Amis, the author, who said that no something like no sensual pleasure, or he was talking about smoking, I think, which I don't hold with, but you know what I mean. Alcohol, meat eating, whatever. No worldly pleasure is worth giving up for the sake of 2 more years in a nursing home in Weston-super-Mare. Is this famous quotation, and it's like, you know, you don't have to take that viewpoint, but there is a trade-off, and if you're living entirely to become Superman in the future, you are on some level, and by definition, missing out on life now, I guess.
Right. One of the I guess big takeaways from this book for me anyway was that it's quite easy to get into a cycle of not deciding what to do with your life, to not making choices, to becoming, to not seeing your own limits, to seeing the limits in others, to thinking, you know, if I do this and then I do this and I do this, you know, if I have all these kind of mini careers, and I don't actually have to decide to kind of go in on one.
Yeah.
And to me, I kind of do think that is another form of this, where it kind of says, well, if I'm going to live forever, then or if I can add another, you know, 100 years, then I don't have to kind of,
Yeah.
It's kind of an avoidance of making a decisions. But I would love to kind of ask you about this, because this was something that I was thinking about, and it's really caught my eye in the book, where you say that often we think that, and I'm paraphrasing here, please forgive me, but you kind of talk about that we often think that, you know, once we make a decision about a career or a partner or a holiday, that we may think that this was the wrong decision. But often when we're stuck in that state of uncertainty, when we're not consciously choosing, often they can be the worst periods to be stuck in.
Yeah.
So I kind of wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that, because that was particularly pertinent for myself.
Yeah, I think it's just, you know, it's just this point that one of the ways we're always doing things, basically, this is my sort of big theory, I suppose. We're always doing things to try to maintain the feeling of being in control of our time at the cost of living the most fulfilling and interesting and accomplished lives. We'd rather choose the feeling of being in control. And there is no better way of feeling in control in many contexts than to not act, than to refrain, than to withhold from action. So, like, you know, if you have this idea that one day you're going to write an amazing novel and it's going to be fantastic and it's going to be critically acclaimed, the best way to hold on to that fantasy is never to begin it in the first place, because once you begin it, by definition, anything you bring into the real world is imperfect. It's harder than you expect, or doesn't go exactly as you planned. People don't respond in the way that you necessarily wanted to. So you actually trade really doing it in an imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable way for this fantasy of not doing it. And I think commitment phobia in relationships, which I have plenty of experience in my earlier adulthood, is totally part of the same thing. It's like, you think about how you don't know for sure that someone is the right person, or you don't like the idea of the ups and downs of being in a long-term relationship, or of feeling claustrophobic or something like that. So you tell yourself that you're going to like not do that yet. You're going to keep your options open. Now, that can be the right decision for somebody. I'm not like recommending everyone gets married at 18 or something, but what I'm trying to show in the book is that, like, that is a choice too. That is a choice to use up some of your finite time in a different way, which, you know, for some people might be a good way, but after a while, you might as well take the other option and actually commit to something. And yeah, you're right. There's all this research, and I think just personal experience as well, that shows that because people love this feeling of being in control by not acting, they think that if they do commit to some course of action, they'll feel constrained and they'll be regretful because it might be the wrong one, or they'll wish that they'd chosen something different. But that's not what happens. If you can make a relatively irreversible decision, if you can burn your bridges a bit and like shut down options, what you find again and again is that people are kind of happy with that, because they're no longer haunted by the thought of whether they should take a different action, whether they should stop and go in a different way. I mean, of course, like people get married and then get divorced, so it's not like these are kind of literally irreversible decisions, but there is this sense of like, you know, even take a smaller example, like once you've raised some issue that you needed to raise with a family member or a friend or something, like you can't unsay it. Once you've so you're already in that stream of time at that point, because you've made there's no going back from that thing. I say absolutely, like parenthood is the most amazing example of this, right? Because right up until the moment of becoming a parent, I don't think I could have given a very decisive answer to the question of whether I sort of really wanted to do that in my life. But then the environment is completely changed by the arrival of the kid. So it's like, great, I never have to worry for the rest of my life about whether I should become a parent, because it's done. So as it happens, it's incredibly rewarding, but regardless of that, it's like the alternatives are off the table. And there's something very relaxing and empowering about that. So, I think a great piece of advice for dealing with procrastination and all sorts of like just sense of being in a rut or anything like that is to like literally look for decisions that you could take. They don't have to be huge ones. I'm not saying like leave your job if you're dissatisfied in it, but just like anything that gets you a little bit further down a path where you're closing off options has this kind of motivating effect further into the future. Because it's more in tune with reality, right? Which is that you are always closing off options anyway. It's just a question of whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think that this kind of brings me on to one thing that I really wanted to ask you. We kind of talked about today that kind of having a child, in some ways, that is a form of a constraint. That kind of constrains you by, obviously now you have to take care of this child, and whilst
you sure do, yeah.
And whilst you're doing that, there's other things that you can't be doing by definition.
Yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, I'd kind of like to branch this idea out to you, where I believe that having constraints in your life is actually a good thing. But kind of, I don't think that's quite a popular idea.
Yeah.
But the reason that I was thinking about this was, and I would say the closest that I've ever come in my own life to having an addiction was to playing Call of Duty back when I was a teenager. And one of the things that I found just incredibly seductive about this was that it had these very bright lines in the game. Right. You knew exactly, I need to do this and I need to do this to progress in the next level. Don't do this. I know I can't do this. And I found that to be so utterly just kind of compelling.
Oh, wow.
And I like to think to myself that kind of in my own life, kind of when I give myself those bright lines, I say to myself, you know what, on a Saturday, you're not going to reply to any emails.
Yeah.
When I tell myself, okay, I'm going to take this day off or this day off, or I put these rules in place for myself, that my life becomes better. But people tend to think the opposite. So I wonder if you kind of relate to that point.
I totally do. Yeah. I mean, as ever, I want to phrase it in a very slightly different way, which is to say, it's not quite living an unconstrained life or a constrained one. It's actually just more about consciously inviting and choosing specific constraints, which is good, versus the situation we're in anyway, which is constrained, right? So we are, what's a good way of describing this? I mean, like we are constrained by reality, whether we like it or not. So to pick one example that I sometimes get into trouble about, like there's a bit in the book where I'm slightly sort of critical of the idea of being a digital nomad, right? This idea that the purest freedom in life, the highest lifestyle would be to just be able to go anywhere you wanted, whenever you wanted, and run your business from wherever you liked. And actually, plenty of people who've done this maybe it's an important life experience to go through, but plenty of people who've done this will say that actually a problem of it is you get really lonely because your closest friends are digital nomads on the other side of the world, or you don't know anybody in the place you're staying and you just got there 3 weeks ago, or you don't speak the language. So in that situation, a person living a supposedly unconstrained life is actually really constrained, right? They're constrained by being alien to that culture, or they're constrained by the distance between them and the people they'd like to be hanging out with. It's not that they're not constrained by the sort of circumstances of reality. It's that they are it's that they pursued a feeling of not being constrained and then get constraints they don't really bargain for. So whereas when I think you talk about rules about when to answer things, or taking a day a week as a day of rest and all these things, or having kids if you do it in a sort of in any kind of a planned or conscious way, you're just like choosing which problems to have, as it were, right? You're choosing which constraints are going to bind you, because being unbound by any constraints is not an option. Something's going to constrain you. It's just going to be something you didn't want, like loneliness or any number of other things. So so I think what you're doing in those moments, the reason I think that's so helpful and healthy to choose constraints, is because you're acknowledging something that's already sort of non-negotiably true about being a human, which is that you'll be constrained, and then you're using what power you have in the world to choose the ones that are healthy and good for you and for the things you're interested in doing. If you think secretly, like, or not secretly, like lots of people in the world seem to, that a non-constrained life is possible, then you're going to continually end up choosing bad constraints in reality, because you're going to be like, I don't have to be constrained, and then the constraints will just like pop up and frustrate your actions. So I think it's that same old idea that, like, you're going to be following somebody's agenda. It's just a question of whether you consciously participate in that or not. You're going to be limited as a human, and the superpower is to see that truth and then exert some influence over which limitations you go for, rather than chasing this fantasy of none of them. Yeah.
I think an excellent point, and I think that point about that you raise in the book about the digital nomad, when I read that, I remember thinking back to a girl that I knew from school, and her entire life she'd always wanted to become a medical doctor, and she kind of went through university, studied medicine, worked as a junior doctor, and by the kind of end of the second year of training, she was kind of fed up with it and said, I kind of want to go and try another life, a responsibility kind of free life. So she trained as an air hostess, and I think she kind of had this idea of sitting carefree in Dubai on a beach, and in Bali and all these things. And she did it for 6 months and come back, and I remember a conversation I had with her, because you would think this sounds idyllic, and she said, honestly, said it was the most miserable I've ever been. And I said to her, what was so bad? But she said, honestly, I was exhausted in all these different time zones. You only get 1 or 2 different days in each places. The places that I thought I wanted to go and see, I was rushed all the time there. But I do also think that we're so chronically aware of all these amazing places in the world that it becomes so, particularly with social media and with TikTok, that we're far more aware of these things than, for instance, as you mentioned, but back in the days when you just had to go and catch the local cockfight after tending to your cows.
That was it. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think this is a whole other piece of it. It's like there are all these different phases. So go back far enough, people probably believed in an afterlife anyway, which means it's less stressful to try to get all the experiences you can out of this life because you're going to live forever. Or they believed in cyclical ideas about history, so it was all going to come back again and back again forever. Then even just like fast forward centuries to just like 50, 40, 30 years ago. It's a different situation, but there isn't the level of digital information connectivity that we have today that sort of, number one, is exposing you to all of these other things you could be doing, places you could be going, lives you could be living, people you could be dating, whatever. But with sort of algorithmically organized social media, it's finding the specific ones that you're going to be wanting to do, right? So to exist in these digital spaces today is to just be constantly bombarded with much more stuff than you could ever make time for or have the ability to do, and to be especially shown all the ones that are most perfectly tuned to your interests and obsessions and talents and passions. So it's like, it's a nightmare, because I mean, it's very helpful from the point of view of consumer capitalism, I suppose. But it if you think that you're going to get your arms around it all, if you think that the main thing, if you think that what would qualify as a fulfilling life is that you got to the end of your life and you'd like done all those things, then yeah, it's going to be a recipe for despair and disappointment and anxiety. So I think one of the things I'm trying to do always in this book and in other stuff I do is to really just sort of, it's kind of a backwards way of getting to fulfillment in a way, because it's kind of like saying, look, like this thing you're trying to do that feels so difficult to you, which namely like get your arms around it all, get on top of it all. I'm going to try and show you that it's even more difficult than you think, right? That it's like, it's such a non-starter, it's so impossible that maybe if I can make it clear how impossible it is, you'll give up doing it and focus instead on just choosing a few of those experiences, having one of those a million potential relationships, you know, and actually like come into life as it really is. So, you know, some people writing books and advicey book type books are trying to sort of lift people's spirits. I always feel like I'm trying to disappoint them so much that they like come around the other end, and it's like, okay, I'm going to give that up because it is just so impossible. I can do this instead and actually be happier and accomplish more that way.
I totally agree, and kind of, I, you know, to pay testament to your book, I think that it really does, or it really did for me anyway, kind of illuminated a perspective change. And one of the things that I was thinking about was kind of during the very first lockdown that I think, you know, many people kind of thought that it was going to be this kind of terrible thing, kind of all the freedoms have taken away. But some people I speak to today, and I'm certainly not minimizing the experience of people that had terrible experiences that lost loved ones, but I certainly would kind of like to illuminate this. And some friends I have that, like myself, like the people that listen to this show, type A personalities, very, very driven, that kind of want to maximize. And they told me that during lockdown, they were kind of thrust into another mode of being. You know, one friend, he described it to me as, he said that he become obsessed with this idea, you know, real high performer. He said I become obsessed with this idea since then of, I believe the Italians call it dolce far niente, the sweetness of doing nothing. And kind of another friend told me, said that similar to kind of what you're describing, that they felt more in tune with the sense of time, which I know sounds sort of kind of wishy-washy, but I heard time and time again, when people slowed down, they kind of felt more connected with themselves, more connected with you know, the kind of world around them. They had conversations with their families that kind of they'd never had before. So I kind of just like to talk to you about this. And in the book, you talk about the kind of limits of, I believe you call it finitude. My pronunciation's not too good.
Sure. Finitude. I don't know.
Finitude. Yeah, not too good at pronouncing it. But kind of, there does seem to be an effect that when we embrace that you kind of do reach a kind of, you would kind of do tune more into, I guess, perhaps the frequency of time that you've kind of talked about. believe. Is that kind of something that you were kind of shooting for with?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's all just about coming back to our real situation. And so, yeah, absolutely. The experience of COVID, the disease for a lot of people, has been absolutely awful. The experience of lockdown, like, there's lots of strong arguments made against the degree to which many countries lock down and the ways that lockdown has had its victims. But one thing that all of these things do, for some people in a pleasant way and other people in a very distressing way, is like push reality into their faces. And if you're somebody who's been sort of chasing this future state of being able to do everything, or being able to like be sort of so efficient that you can move at the speed of light and handle everything that's thrown at you, if you're completely forced, like by the law, to stop and stay home and not go to the office and all the rest of it, then there's totally something kind of edifying about that, even in the midst of all this awfulness, because you're sort of deprived of this carrot that you're chasing, and you have to sort of suddenly come back to like where you are and say, what can I do here and now? And on the other hand, sort of at the same time, in the opposite direction, there's this sense of like, well, if all these assumptions are going to be thrown up in the air, like I can't assume anymore that I get to go to my place of work tomorrow. I can't assume, like, apparently we live in now in a, I mean, we always did, I would argue, but we see now that we live in this kind of radically uncertain world where you can't guarantee what the world is going to look like a week from now. That seems like a good argument for just doing the thing that you've been putting off doing, right? I mean, that seems like quite a good argument for saying, like, I mean, I shouldn't bank on doing that cool thing I want to do in 10 years when I'm fully qualified, or in 40 years when I'm retired, or something like this, because, we might all be living in a terrible dystopia by then, kind of, foraging for scraps of food in a nuclear wasteland. I mean, I'm joking, but the point is, it's like it takes away that dependability of the future, which I think is actually quite useful, because it brings you back to like making the most of the present.
Right, and I think that kind of that was actually one of the take-home messages that I had from Tim Ferriss's book when I read it a number of years ago, which was that don't postpone the present, don't
Yeah,
delay living now for a holiday 11 months away, or
yeah,
until after you qualify. And I
yeah.
think that your book kind of in many similar ways kind of paints that measure. I wonder, could you talk about that, about that, maybe the cost of delaying living now for potentially a future which we're not even guaranteed?
Yeah, I mean, well, on some level, I think you just said it, and I think uh, that part of 4 Hour Work Week was always for me the bit that like completely struck home. That idea of mini retirements, and not and not putting it all onto retirement. There's something very similar happens with people who tell themselves they're going to go off and work in a job they don't really want to do, but it pays really well for a decade or something. Go and work in high finance, even though you don't really want to do that, and then you're going to take the money and live the life you want. And of course, firstly, you can't guarantee you'll get that future, but secondly, people get accustomed to a lifestyle and then they can't bring themselves to leave it. And so there's all of these things are arguments against putting off. I guess the argument I make in the book is that this putting off into the future is sort of almost like a natural consequence of trying too hard to make the best use of time, because in a way the very idea of use implies a future outcome, right? You're doing it for some reason. And um, and so even if you're enjoying your work now, if you're fully invested in the notion that the reason you're doing it is the result, then you are going to end up living in the future rather than in the present. And to some extent, that's fine. And we wouldn't get anything good done in the world if we didn't have some aspect of that. And I totally do. I don't just sort of sit around all day staring at the flowers and doing nothing. I've got projects and try to get through them and complete them. But it's really easy to overinvest in that, and our culture constantly encourages us to overinvest in that. So I think this is a case for two things. Partly it's a case for doing those cool things now, right? Not waiting till retirement if it's a kind of if it's leisure, but also not waiting. I mean, probably something that is more of an issue to someone like, I don't know, your age, the age of what I imagine is the average age of someone listening to this, is not so much setting a lot of store by what they're going to do in their 60s and 70s, but it might be more like waiting a few more years until you feel qualified to do something, or until you have experience under your belt, or until you've acquired enough capital to make some risk worth taking. And, absolutely that can be a wise decision based on the specific circumstances, but it's incredibly tempting to rely on that because it's comforting, right? It enables you to stay in your comfort zone today because it's going to be later that you do the thing that you really care about, or that you really think is important. And I think that, when you see that that's going on, and you see how it kind of takes meaning away from the present and puts it all into the future, that can be a good spur to be like, just, I think ultimately the way time works is you just have to do some of the thing you want to be doing with your life today or this week, and not be sort of waiting until you've got the right level of control over circumstances to act, because that level of control kind of never arrives. And if there's anybody in their 20s listening to this thinking that by the time they're in their 40s they would feel like they knew what they were doing in their career, I'm one data point to say that you never actually do feel like you know what you're doing. So there's no reason to wait.
I love it. I would love to ask you, because you've kind of been in, I guess, the self-help productivity space. You obviously wrote a column for The Guardian,
Sure have.
trying all these tactics out. What do you think is the worst piece of self-help advice that comes to mind?
That's interesting, because a lot of self-help advice and certainly techniques I've come to think are not bad. They're just very easy to misuse. So, if you come at them thinking that they're going to like enable you to do everything or save your soul, then they're going to go terribly wrong. But that doesn't mean they're bad. Lots and lots of stuff that I might have mocked early on in my days writing the Guardian column, I think it's possible for them to be part of life. I suppose I'm trying to think of a specific piece of advice, but I think that I'll get to it maybe. But the area that I think is really bad advice is basically anything that sets you up and encourages you to like fight with yourself and sort of be aggressive towards yourself, to demand so much of yourself that you're basically fighting yourself. Because in my experience, all that does is like yourself fights back, and you just end up like in a sort of resentful mess of procrastination and non-productivity. So there's a certain kind of sort of tough self-help advice, which is just about like, you're not going to enjoy it, you've just got to do it, you just got to make yourself do it, you've got to associate you've got to change it so that you associate massive pain. Is that Anthony Robbins? Probably, I don't know. He's got a lot of good advice as well hidden in there. But anyway, you've got to associate massive pain with the outcomes that you don't want, and massive pleasure with the outcomes that you do want, and you've got to sort of berate yourself constantly. I'm trying to think if there's like a famous mantra that I can attack here, but it's that feel. I'm sure you know what I mean, right? That feel of like, and anything as well. And this is related, anything that is to do with total transformation starting tomorrow. This idea that that you can have a complete fresh start and leave behind the whole person that you used to be in favor of somebody else, which is a completely illogical idea, because it's always the old you who is constructing this new you that you want to launch. So you drag your old personality through your life, whether you like it or not. All that kind of absolutism as well, I think, is really unhelpful. I don't know if that quite answered your question.
Oh, absolutely. And kind of the sort of being in a fight with yourself. I see this all the time as well, when I see on Instagram, and this was quite big back in the days where people would give the advice of just sleep fewer hours,
Right. Yeah.
and there's always more, you can get more hours. If you sleep 2 hours less, you can work 2 hours more.
Yeah.
And that seems to be quite a miserable existence.
Yeah, and I mean, I always want to say, and it's like, there can be contexts where the trade-off to make would be less sleep. I think so, sure. I mean, but it's this idea that it's going to get you to this place where like peace of mind reigns. No, you're just going to be tired. Now, maybe it's going to be worth being tired at certain sort of fixed periods of your work life if you're launching something big or something like that, But don't imagine that it's going to pay off in being like happy and relaxed and fulfilled. It's just going to ingrain the habit of, working too hard and shouting at yourself inside your head.
I love it. I love it. I'd love to kind of ask you, because we've gone over so much today. We've kind of gone over embracing limitations, kind of being mindful of, of delaying life, procrastination as a control strategy, consciously making decisions. We've covered so much today. I would love to kind of ask you just one topic which really really piqued my interest at kind of
Sure.
at the end of the book, and that was your chapter on cosmic insignificance therapy. And kind of, again, your book is a lovely antidote to the modern culture, where it seems to be kind of the opposite to what we kind of see today in this kind of overly inflated, sort of narcissistic kind of era. So I'd love to, if you could kind of talk a little bit about this idea of cosmic insignificance therapy.
Yeah, this is just my sort of frivolous term for the idea that there's something really good, relaxing, but also empowering about really thinking about how little our lives matter in the cosmic scheme of things, right? What a tiny piece of the current humanity you are, and then also in temporal terms, like how tiny your life is going to be compared to the entire history of the cosmos in each direction, the history and the future. And obviously one place people go with this is to sort of nihilism and this idea like, well, why do anything if it can't, if I'm so small and tiny and insignificant? But I don't have a lot of patience with that conclusion, because I think that it's a little arbitrary that we even define a meaningful life as it's got to somehow impact history for centuries to come, or it's got to change the lives of millions of people on the planet. And of course, we do live in this world now that especially celebrates fame and celebrity in a sort of unique way. But there's no reason to believe that that's a particularly meaningful path to pursue. And so my idea in this section is sort of to say, and this is partly, there are Stoic exercises that touch on this as well. It's certainly not a brand new idea, that like often we're paralyzed by indecision, or we hold back from making bold and risky moves in life because on some level we overestimate how much it matters to reality what we do. And that the reminder that like, nobody's going to care in 200 years time. Half the decisions that I fret about, I don't care about in a week's time, so this is a reason to just do stuff and to lower the stakes of like, to lower what's at stake when deciding, and to be like, look, I don't know for sure that this move from one city to another or whatever is going to pay off. Of course I don't, but like, it doesn't really matter as much as I've maybe been thinking that it does. And then the other piece of this is that if you can drop a bit that notion that a meaningful life has to be extraordinary and has to be sort of noteworthy to other people, that we all have to be Elon Musk or, I don't know, Shakespeare, first, I mean, I'm quoting here the philosopher Ido Landau, who points out that, like, firstly, this is crazy because the number of people who have the talent to become Shakespeare in any given generation is probably like one or two, and therefore you're just sort of setting yourself up to fail, because however amazing you are, you're probably not quite that good at writing plays or whatever it might be. But secondly, just the experience that we have in life is not that things are only meaningful, that things only feel meaningful if they have that kind of effect. Sometimes it seems to be quite the opposite. You know, it is some very local, very domestic experience, or it is doing something that helped your community, or doing something that, cooking nutritious meals for your kid. You know, these things really give you that feeling of like, I am actually doing the right thing here. It's like, this is a good use of my time on the planet. Nobody's ever going to know about them. I'm always struck in my own work even that, like, you know, I love the fact that this book is selling more copies than I thought, and like that sort of, you know, low level of fame that you get from being a author, which is not really fame, but it's like I've got a big enough ego to find that enjoyable. But easily the most sort of fulfilling bits of doing this book have been like individual emails from individual people about discussing this stuff or what it meant to them or whatever. And that's not a function of the numbers. That's not because I've got thousands of them or something. That's just an example of the fact that what gives us meaning in life is very often these one-to-one connections, or one relationship, or a location that you love to visit, or something like that. So there's really no reason to hang the meaning of your life on like wowing the planet. That might be your destiny, but it also might well not be, and that's fine.
That's a fantastic message, and I think it's a great reminder for people that think that, you know, to have an impact, I need to win a Nobel Prize.
Right.
Maybe you just need to go and look after your elderly grandmother for an afternoon. You know, the
right.
The impact still there. So I love that message. We always just sign off with 2 quick fire questions.
Sure.
I'd love to ask you, so obviously, so you wrote a fantastic book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. But I would love to ask you, and I'd be particularly interested to know kind of what you suggest, or kind of what books that you could recommend have really impacted your life that you can share with our audience.
Well, I've been really into almost all the books written by a Jungian psychotherapist called James Hollis, who I quote in the book. Actually, pretty much anything he's ever written is worth your time. It's a very sort of, he's a great writer, and it's very humorous and down to earth, but it's also really gets at this idea that a meaningful life is not necessarily happy most of the time, that the experiences we really crave are experiences of like becoming who we are in some slightly mysterious way, and that can involve difficulties and negative experiences, and it's actually means a lot more to us in the end than constantly chasing happiness per se. And then I've been really impacted by a lot of books that come broadly from a kind of Zen Buddhist background. There's a book called Nothing Special by an American Buddhist called Charlotte Jocko Beck, which is just little essays, but they really sort of offer that fundamental Zen perspective shift. One of the things that she's so good at expressing is this notion that we sort of treat life as a problem to be solved, and then we experience endless anxiety and frustration because we can't solve being alive. And actually the problem here is treating it as a problem. The problem is not that you haven't found a solution. The problem is that you thought there ought to be a solution. So those are a couple of the authors who've made an impact on me.
Right. Problems in life are a feature and not a bug. So
yeah, absolutely. Yes. You wouldn't want to have no problems. It's good to not have the really worst kinds of problems. Absolutely. But waiting for the time when there are no problems is a futile approach to living. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the last question, which we always sign off, but you've kind of talked quite a bit about already today. But the last question we ask before I'll ask you to sign off and tell these guys where they can connect with you and to signpost them wherever you want them to, is what makes a life worth living?
It's funny because I sort of write about it and think about it and talk about it, and then you sort of put it in such a direct way, and I'm like, I think a good way of thinking about the answer to this question is what makes a life worth living is that you actually, and I'm paraphrasing myself in the book here, but that you actually get around to doing whatever it was that you came here for. Now, I know that that sort of conjures an idea that we all have a destiny or a life purpose, or that like God has an idea for us or something. I don't really mean to imply any of those things. I just mean that like, if it's useful to think in terms of like, what am I here to do? What could like the world use that I've got? And I think then to get around to doing that instead of constantly putting it off and never quite getting around to it, that is one way of understanding a meaningful life, a life well lived.
I love it. Where can these guys connect with you, and where would you like to signpost our audience to?
Well, the book 4,000 Weeks is available wherever you get books. That makes a big difference. Audiobooks as well. Then my website, oliverburkeman.com, you can sign up for my newsletter, which I call The Imperfectionist, and find out other stuff there. Yeah.
Amazing. We will link everything below. So if anyone's listening or watching this, they can just swipe up on this episode, and everything that I've talked with Oliver about today will be there. Man, this was a real treat, a real privilege for me. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.